Before I get on to the topic for today, I want to talk about a few channel-related matters. There's been a considerable break since I last uploaded anything. This was due to a technical failure at this end. In other words, my computer became incapable of carrying out most functions. But we're back now, in large part thanks to the kind assistance of a benefactor, and I have a number of projects for the next few months, which I'll briefly outline now. The first is a running commentary on a later and difficult dialogue of Plato's The Theaetetus. This will be ongoing due to the density of the text and will likely take a few months to complete. However, there will also be plenty of other material on different topics concurrently with this Theaetetus reading. For instance, I will be starting a new project on philosophy and cinema, which will be ongoing, and for which I will upload material from time to time. I want to begin with a series on the great Russian director Andrei Tarkovsky. I want to start with his theory of art in general and of film in particular, based largely on his own writings, and to locate his influences, in particular his debt to Nikolai Berdyev's philosophy of personalism and the more subtle influences of Byzantine iconography on his theory of the image. I want to argue that Tarkovsky held to a broadly Platonic theory of the image, that is, the image as such and not just the visual image. The final item of news concerns some very helpful feedback I have received from a number of subscribers. I have decided to replicate the channel as a podcast, at least for any uploads that do not crucially depend on any visual media. This will make the channel much easier to access, especially for people on the move, commuting or during a session in the gym, that kind of thing. I hope to have this up and running by the new year, and I'll keep you informed of this development. Sometime later in the New Year period, I want to add a Substack account for Socratic inquiries, where I'll post written pieces and where I'll post up the show notes for all previous presentations, as well as those yet to come. I want to take this opportunity to thank everyone, viewers and subscribers, especially those who have contacted me with feedback, some of it constructively critical, but all of which has been immensely valuable and very welcome. So a big thank you to everybody. But now on to the topic of this presentation, Socratic ignorance and conviction. In the dialogue Gorgias, Socrates argues strongly for the following claim: it is more shameful to commit an injustice than it is to suffer one. For the moment, I don't want to discuss the larger context of this argument, as I want to reserve that for a short series in the near future. For now, though, I want to focus on one aspect of this argument, which arises at Stephanus page number 508 to 509, namely the vehemence with which Socrates maintains this claim, and a possible question that might then arise: is there not here a conflict with his well-known claim to lack knowledge? I want to maintain that not only is this perfectly consistent with his claim to lack knowledge, but that in this passage we discover something of crucial significance for the issue of justification. By this I mean our justification for holding some proposition to be true. In the series Socratic Method, I discussed the meaning of Socratic ignorance, both in terms of the figure of Socrates himself, but also as something that is crucial for motivating genuine inquiry. I'll briefly recap now before moving on to the argument in the Gorgias. Famously, Socrates claims not to have knowledge, but he prizes its possession above all other human goods. To this end, Socrates seeks out any and all people reputed to have knowledge, or who themselves claim to have knowledge, in order to learn something from them. There are around a dozen dialogues by Plato which depict Socrates questioning these people, but in every case, not one of them, as it turns out, actually possesses the knowledge they claim for themselves, or for which they are reputed to have. The aim of this procedure, dubbed Socratic Method by scholars, is to remove the conceit of knowledge and thereby induce a state of perplexity, or aporia as it is in Greek. Socrates believes that the state of aporia will act as a powerful motivator towards genuine inquiry into whatever it was one previously claimed to have knowledge. The topics we see Socrates pursuing in these dialogues are always of an ethical nature. However, not having knowledge is not the same thing as not having opinions and beliefs, or even strongly held convictions. What knowledge actually is never directly addressed in this series of dialogues, but in later works, principally the Republic and the Theaetetus, Plato presents two essential marks of what knowledge would be. The first concerns the object of knowledge itself. It must be of being, and secondly, the state of knowing must have the character of infallibility. This is likely what Socrates himself would have thought about knowledge. By being, Plato means that the object of knowledge is real, intelligible, and immutable, and this is why Plato thinks the object of knowledge proper will be the intelligible form of a thing, its paradigm or paradigma, as he calls it in a couple of places. Infallibility refers to the state of the knower, that they cannot be mistaken about this. A simple example could illustrate this. The geometric circle is an object that is in some sense real, it is certainly intelligible, and it is immutable. The state of knowing its properties involve infallibility. For instance, that the ratio of the circumference to the diameter is 3.141, etc., is a property of the circle that we cannot be mistaken about. A, on account of its immutability, that's to say a circle is a circle is a circle, and B, of grasping this fact intellectually. We can call this kind of truth a necessary truth, because when we understand it, we understand that it cannot be false, and then we cannot be mistaken about it. We have good reason to think that Socrates himself would have had something like this in mind when he attested to his lack of knowledge. That is, he lacked this level of cognition about the things which interested him, what we would class as ethical knowledge. Now, he would have had no difficulty agreeing to knowledge of mathematical truths, but it was in the area of ethics and moral truths that he lacked knowledge. What Socrates disavows, but desires above all, is something like the level of cognition about ethical things that we can and do have about mathematical things. Not that these objects are the same kind, of course not, but that we may have infallible knowledge of them, as we do with mathematical truths, is a hope that Socrates seems to cherish. This is what motivates Socrates in his philosophical activity, the hope of attaining to this kind of knowledge about ethical things as well as certain other non-mathematical objects. Now, to come on to the passage from the Gorgias that I want to discuss, in this passage we will see that Socrates is maintaining a certain proposition to be true, while at the same time disclaiming sure and certain knowledge of the matter itself. The proposition is this: it is more shameful to commit an injustice than it is to suffer one. So I read the passage in full, which is also in 2 slides. That being so, let's examine what it is you're taking me to task for, and whether it's right or not. You say that I'm unable to protect either myself or any of my friends or relatives, or rescue them from the gravest dangers, and that I'm at the mercy of the first comer, just as people without rights are, whether he wants to knock me on the jaw, to use that forceful expression of yours, or confiscate my property, or exile me from the city, or ultimately put me to death. To be in that position is, by your reasoning, the most shameful thing of all. As for what my own reasoning is, that's been told many times by now, but there's nothing to stop it being told once again. I deny, Callicles, that being knocked on the jaw unjustly is the most shameful thing, or that having my body or my purse cut is, and I affirm that to knock or cut me or my possessions unjustly is both more shameful and worse, and at the same time that to rob or enslave me, or to break into my house, or, to sum up, to commit any unjust act at all against me and my possessions, is both worse and more shameful for the one who does these unjust acts than it is for me, the one who suffers them. These conclusions at which we arrived earlier in our previous discussions are, I'd say, held down and bound by arguments of iron and adamant, even if it's rather rude to say so. So it would seem, anyhow. And if you, or someone more forceful than you, won't undo them, then anyone who says anything other than what I'm now saying cannot be speaking well. And yet, for my part, my account is ever the same. I don't know how these things are, but no one I've ever met, as in this case, can say anything else without being ridiculous." End quote. So here we have Socrates arguing that to commit an injustice is more shameful than suffering one. In fact, his real view, stated elsewhere, is that there is no shame attached to suffering an injustice, but here he argues minimally only that committing an injustice is more shameful. He says he holds this with iron and adamant, meaning that he holds this principle with the greatest firmness, yet still falling short of knowledge itself, as he adds. I think there's an important general lesson for us here concerning our epistemic claims. Socrates seems to be stating what looks like a principle, namely, that it is worse to commit an injustice than to suffer one. And the thing about principles is that they are rather like axioms, say, of the geometric kind. They cannot be proved as such, or only with very great difficulty. Rather, they simply must be grasped if one is to do geometry. In Book 4 of his Metaphysics, Aristotle devotes the entirety of that section to the principle of non-contradiction, and in particular to its indemonstrability. This is because the process of demonstration, or proof itself, presupposes the principle of non-contradiction, and in fact any kind of indication whatsoever also presupposes it. So if I wordlessly point to something, I am singling out that something from all the rest of the things that exist. And this act itself presupposes the principle of non-contradiction. That is, that something can be this definite thing as distinct from any other definite thing. Instead of proving the principle of non-contradiction, which would be impossible, Aristotle pursues another method, that is, to investigate the consequences of denying the principle of non-contradiction, and so much of what follows in Book 4 is devoted to this very procedure. Each particular denial results in absurdity, and so the principle of non-contradiction seems unassailable, and it is difficult to envisage how it could be undermined. Later, I will be presenting a series of talks on the principle of non-contradiction, but for now, we simply note that fundamental principles, especially of this nature, are to be grasped rather than proved. This is what Aristotle calls wisdom, Sophia, as opposed to scientific knowledge, episteme. Wisdom is concerned with grasping principles, whereas scientific knowledge begins by presupposing these principles. The question we can put to this passage from the Gorgias is this: is Socrates stating something like a principle here? It would appear that he is, and we could put it like this: doing wrong is worse than suffering wrong. It looks like this follows by definition, that is, that doing wrong is never right. This must be the case when we simply grasp the meaning of terms like right and wrong or good and evil. Socrates is justified in holding it while maintaining his oft-proclaimed lack of knowledge, which he repeats here. I don't know how these things are, he says. That is, he does not have the knowledge of why this is the case, only that he cannot see how it could not be the case. As he says, no one I've ever met, as in this case, can say anything else without being ridiculous. One is reminded here of Aristotle's procedure with the principle of non-contradiction. The consequences of its denial are absurdity in each case, and so too here, where Socrates says much the same thing about his moral principle that he's introduced. However, Socrates is not Aristotle, so we cannot assume he would have agreed with the latter about the nature of knowledge as such. But as a kind of an exercise, let's suppose that in the Gorgias passage, Socrates is expressing a principle in something like the Aristotelian sense. Well, this would be perfectly compatible with his famous disavowal of knowledge, for then he is only disavowing a scientific knowledge of this principle, if for no other reason than, as Aristotle says, principles must be grasped by the intellect but cannot be demonstrated, what he terms Sophia. These principles are in turn the bases of demonstrations, in a manner analogous to geometric method. Perhaps then it is this which Socrates disavows, namely a scientific knowledge of ethical principles. That is, that he cannot demonstrate that committing an injustice is more shameful than suffering one. But as he says, any attempt to say otherwise has always ended in the speaker sounding ridiculous. One of the marks of knowledge in the scientific sense is being able to provide demonstrations or proofs, a view Socrates seems to hold, but which will only be fully developed later by Aristotle. Let's put this then into an Aristotelian framework and see what happens. Socrates has intellectually grasped the principle that committing an injustice is more shameful than suffering one. Now, presumably he could then go on and use this as a principle for developing something like a science of ethics, and it's precisely this kind of knowledge that he disavows. This is a demonstrative knowledge, a science of ethics, but this is perhaps what he most values above all other human goods, a scientific knowledge of ethics. Now, later Aristotle takes issue with the implicit claim that there could be something like a science of ethics, if indeed Socrates is somehow making such a claim. It does seem as if he is doing that, for he tends to explain wrongdoing as a result of inadequate knowledge, according to a theory which scholars have termed Socratic intellectualism. This is the view that no one errs willingly or knowingly, and it will be the subject of a future series here on the channel. But for now, very simply, it is the view that moral error or wrongdoing is to be explained as a kind of ignorance. It's a view that Aristotle will criticize and reject, but is one which the Stoic school of philosophy will make the centerpiece of its ethical teachings. Stoicism was founded at a time which overlaps with the life of Aristotle, and it should be observed here that all the different schools of philosophy that sprung up in the mid-4th century BC, and there were quite a few of them, except Epicureanism, claim Socrates as their founder. So, to conclude, this Gorgias passage is highly suggestive and may cast some light on what exactly it is that Socrates disavows when he says he does not have knowledge. Perhaps Socrates seeks something like a scientific knowledge of ethics. But if Aristotle is right, this kind of knowledge of ethics must remain elusive, but for reasons I haven't discussed here. Going on what he says in some other dialogues, Socrates certainly seems to agree that being able to provide demonstrations is a mark of having knowledge, yet this is precisely what is lacking here, and on his own admission. However, he does operate with something that both looks like an Aristotelian principle and which seems to function like one too. If this speculative line of inquiry I've been pursuing here has anything to it, then the elusiveness of ethical knowledge, of the kind Socrates seems to seek, will ultimately have to be explained in terms of the subject matter itself. That is, there is something in the nature of ethical knowledge that cannot become a demonstrative knowledge, like, for instance, geometry, or any science, strictly speaking. If this is so, or at least if we are on the right track, then it would seem that Socrates expects too much from ethical knowledge. Is it that the problem of Socratic intellectualism seems to relate to this? Socrates conceives of right or wrong action in terms of knowledge or its lack. And I can't pursue this here as it's a large and difficult topic that deserves a series of its own, but it could be that Socrates has epistemic expectations in the area of ethics that the nature of the subject matter itself simply does not allow. And on the positive side, even though Socrates disavows knowledge, specifically ethical knowledge, he nevertheless maintains that he holds the principle that committing an injustice is more shameful than suffering one, with iron and adamant, and that anyone who has ever tried to say otherwise has ended up becoming ridiculous. I think we can grant him this. I think we can also say with confidence that there is no conflict here with his famous disavowal of knowledge, for he is only making the weaker claim that no one has ever been able to dislodge this principle. Why attempts to do so turn out ridiculous is an interesting question and leads into various notorious arguments that would reduce moral principles to something like sly ploys by the weak to undermine the strong. But in his discourse with Callicles in the Gorgias, who is himself an aggressive spokesman for this point of view, the attempt does indeed become ridiculous. But that is a topic for later.